The maid screamed and dropped the tray. Solomon Adami, a man who had not stood on his own 2 feet in 11 months, was laughing so hard he could barely breathe, both arms thrown up over his head, moving to a rhythm his body had no business remembering, because a 6-year-old girl was dancing circles around his wheelchair like her life depended on making him move. Nobody had given her permission to be there. Nobody had given her permission to touch him, to spin her small body across his private garden like it belonged to her, to grab his hands mid-spin and pull his arms into the air like a conductor, commanding an orchestra only she could hear. And nobody, least of all Grace Ackafer, standing frozen at the edge of the hedge with a tray of untouched tea shaking in her hands, had given her permission to make the most powerful man in Lagos throw his head back and laugh like a boy again. What happened in the next 90 seconds would end up on the front page of 3 newspapers, cost a neurosurgeon his medical license, and prove that a plastic basin sitting forgotten in the grass was about to change everything about how this story would end. But 6 minutes earlier, none of it had started yet. 6 minutes earlier, NMA Ackafer had been standing very still at the edge of the East Garden, watching a man she had never met sit motionless beneath a flame tree the way he sat motionless every single afternoon, and deciding, the way only a 6-year-old fully convinced of her own instincts can decide, that today was the day she was going to make him move. She didn't walk toward him. She didn't kneel. She didn't reach for the basin still sitting untouched by the hedge where she'd left it that morning. She danced. She started small, a shuffle of bare feet against the grass, arms swinging loose at her sides, humming a tune under her breath that Grace would recognize instantly the moment she rounded the corner with the afternoon tea. Then bigger, a spin, a stumble she turned into a bow, both hands thrown skyward like she was catching something falling from the sky. Solomon Adami's eyes lifted from the middle distance, where they usually stayed fixed for hours, tracked toward the small, spinning shape cutting across his private lawn, and did something they had not done in 11 months. They followed movement, on purpose, because they wanted to. "What," he said slowly, "do you think you're doing?" NMA didn't stop dancing to answer him. "Waking up your legs," she said, spinning past his wheelchair close enough that the breeze from her movement stirred the blanket over his knees. "Grandma Ijoma said sleeping things wake up faster when they hear something dancing nearby." "That's not a real medical theory," Solomon said, though something in his chest had already started loosening, some old, rusted mechanism creaking back into motion against his will. "It doesn't have to be medical," NMA said, undeterred, hopping backward, forward, sideways, a rhythm that made no logical sense and somehow, infuriatingly, made him want to tap his fingers against the armrest of his chair. "It just has to work." And that was the exact moment Grace turned the corner with the tea tray, saw her daughter dancing unsupervised and unauthorized directly in front of Solomon Adami, watched the tray tilt out of her own suddenly nerveless hands, and heard, rising over the shattering porcelain, a sound she had genuinely believed this house had forgotten how to make. Solomon Adami, laughing. Not politely, not for show. Loud, rough, unguarded laughter, both arms lifted without his permission, moving, actually moving, shoulders rolling, hands clapping out of rhythm but clapping all the same like a man whose body had briefly, gloriously forgotten it had ever been told it couldn't. "NMA," Grace's voice cracked across the garden, sharp with panic. "NMA, get away from him right now. I am so sorry, sir. I don't know what's gotten into her. She's never." "Don't," Solomon said, still laughing, still moving his arms in time with a girl he'd known for exactly 6 minutes. "Don't you dare call her away." Grace froze mid-step, the shattered tea tray forgotten at her feet, staring at her employer laughing and moving both arms in his wheelchair for the first time in 11 months, staring at her daughter spinning in front of him with an old plastic basin sitting abandoned and forgotten in the grass a few feet away, and felt, for one disorienting moment, like she'd walked into someone else's life entirely. She had no idea, standing frozen at the edge of that garden, that this was only the first 90 seconds of a story that would eventually put her daughter's photograph on the front page of every major newspaper in the city, expose a fraud that had stolen 11 months of a man's hope, and end with her own life, changed as completely as the two people dancing in front of her. She only knew, in that moment, that her daughter had somehow made a paralyzed billionaire laugh with his whole body in under 2 minutes, and that whatever came next, there was no calling it back now. To understand how any of this had happened, you have to go back 3 months, to the night everything in Solomon Adami's life stopped. He had been one of the most powerful men in Lagos, his family's banking and real estate holdings stretching across 3 countries, his name printed on hospital wings and university lecture halls. Then, on a construction site he owned, a crane cable had snapped without warning, and the vehicle he was riding in had folded around the impact like paper. He woke up in a hospital 4 months later to the same sentence, delivered in 3 different accents by 3 different specialists across 2 continents. Complete, permanent, irreversible. His younger sister, Adiz, had taken over daily operations of the family's real estate division without ever once asking his opinion again. His fiancé had left quietly, 6 months after the accident, unable to watch the man she'd loved disappear into a version of himself that no longer recognized his own reflection. His staff had learned not to ask how he was doing, because the answer never changed, and pretending otherwise had become its own particular cruelty. Grace Okafor had worked in his household for 3 years by the time her daughter climbed the estate wall for the first time, cleaning floors that cost more per square foot than her entire childhood apartment, learning the specific silence a house makes when the man who owns it has stopped believing anything good will ever happen inside it again. NMA had shown up unannounced 11 days before the dancing began, having walked from school when the after-school program closed unexpectedly, carrying a plastic basin she'd insisted belonged to her since her great-grandmother's funeral 8 months earlier. That first day, she had knelt in front of Solomon's wheelchair and washed his feet with water she'd somehow carried the entire way, humming a song Grace recognized as one her own mother, Ijoma Okafor, a woman who had spent 40 years quietly healing people the local hospitals had given up on, used to hum while she worked. Solomon had laughed at her that first day, too. Not cruelly. The laughter of a man being told something so far outside the realm of anything he'd been told by 3 continents worth of specialists that his mind genuinely could not process it as anything but a joke. But he had let her come back the next day, and the day after that. For 11 days, the basin ritual continued, quiet, careful, almost solemn, NMA pressing her small thumb into a specific point on his arch that made him report a faint, static-like sensation on the 3rd day, a sensation Grace's own mother had spent decades coaxing back into LIMS doctors had declared permanently lost. Solomon began keeping a private log of every occurrence. He began researching the herbs NMA added to her water, discovering, with quiet astonishment, that several carried genuine anti-inflammatory and circulatory properties his own team of specialists had apparently never bothered investigating. But it was the 12th day, when NMA arrived and simply set the basin down without touching it, that everything changed. "Not today," she'd said, studying him with the same serious expression she brought to everything. "Grandma Ijoma said sometimes the water isn't what wakes things up. Sometimes it's the moving." "I can't move," Solomon had said, the old, familiar bitterness creeping back into his voice. "Your arms can," NMA had said simply. "Grandma Ijoma said dancing isn't about your legs. It's about deciding your body still belongs to you." And so, on the 12th day, she had started to dance. Dear listener, if this story already has you leaning in, take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps stories like this reach the people who need them. Now, back to that garden. By the time Grace finally coaxed her breathing back to something resembling normal that first dancing afternoon, gathering the shattered porcelain with trembling hands, while her daughter and her employer continued their strange, uncoordinated celebration a few feet away, she had already made a decision she wouldn't fully understand the weight of for weeks to come. She wasn't going to stop it. She should have. Every instinct 3 years of careful domestic service had trained into her screamed that she should scoop her daughter up immediately, apologize profusely, and ensure this never, ever happened again. Instead, when Solomon quietly asked, breathless and grinning in a way she'd genuinely never seen on his face before, whether NMA might come back tomorrow, Grace heard herself say yes before she'd finished deciding to. That night, lying awake long after her shift ended, Solomon Adami found himself thinking not about the coastal development project his siblings had been pressuring him to abandon since the accident, not about the quarterly board meeting scheduled for the following week, but about the particular, absurd sensation of his own shoulders moving to a rhythm a 6-year-old had invented on the spot, and how it had felt, for 90 entire seconds, like his body still belonged to him. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself several other things too, none of which he fully believed by the time exhaustion finally pulled him under. The following weeks fell into a rhythm neither of them planned, but both came to quietly depend on. NMA arrived every afternoon at 3, sometimes with the basin, sometimes without it, but always with the dancing, teaching Solomon small, ridiculous movements he could perform from his wheelchair, movements that made no anatomical sense, and somehow, session by session, began to matter more to him than any physical therapy program his specialists had prescribed. Grace watched from a careful distance during most sessions, torn between fierce protectiveness of her daughter and a creeping, unwelcome hope she didn't trust herself to name yet. She had seen wealthy men grow fond of things and discard them just as quickly. She was determined not to let her daughter become anyone's charity project, anyone's temporary amusement to be tossed aside once the novelty wore off. But she also could not ignore what she was witnessing. On the 20th day, during a session where NMA had Solomon attempting to mirror her arm movements in increasingly elaborate sequences, something happened that neither of them was prepared for. NMA had been guiding his right arm through a wide, sweeping arc when Solomon's entire body went suddenly, sharply rigid. "What?" NMA asked immediately, freezing mid-motion. "I felt that," Solomon said, staring down at his leg as though it belonged to a stranger, a faint, unmistakable warmth spreading from his hip toward his knee. "Do it again." NMA repeated the movement. The sensation returned, fainter this time, but real. "It could be nothing," Solomon said, half to himself, his voice shaking despite the words. "Phantom sensation happens sometimes, it doesn't mean." "You don't sound like you believe that," NMA observed, watching his face carefully. He didn't. For the first time in 11 months, he found he didn't want to believe the doubt at all. Grace, watching from a few feet away, felt her own heart pounding. She thought immediately of her mother, of countless afternoons spent as a child watching Ijoma Akhafer coax sensation back into limbs the hospitals had already written off. She had never fully believed her mother possessed any special gift, not really. She had certainly never expected to watch that same gift resurface in her own 6-year-old daughter, directed at one of the wealthiest men in the entire country, through a dance nobody had taught her. That night, alone in the small kitchenette of their staff quarters, Grace allowed herself, for the first time since her mother's funeral, to cry. She wasn't entirely sure whether the tears were grief, fear, or something dangerously close to hope. She suspected, lying awake long afterward, it was probably all three at once. 3 weeks after the dancing began, Solomon requested a formal meeting with Grace in his private study. "I want to do something for NMA," he said carefully, once she'd taken the seat across from him. "Not as payment for what's happening in the garden, but what she's doing has changed something in me that 11 months of the best medical care money could buy never managed to touch. I don't want to pretend that's worth nothing." Grace's shoulders stiffened immediately. "Sir, we don't need." "Let me finish," Solomon said gently. "I'd like to set up an education trust for her, not cash in your hands. An account held separately that covers her schooling for as long as she needs it, whether or not any of this continues." Grace studied him for a long moment. "Why?" she finally asked. "Because for 11 months, nobody in this house made me move without being paid an hourly rate to try," Solomon said quietly. Your daughter marched into my garden and made me laugh with my whole body inside of 2 minutes, expecting nothing in return. That deserves something more than a paycheck. Grace's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall in front of him. For her future, she said, not as payment. Not as payment, Solomon agreed. But even as one relationship deepened, another storm was already gathering just beyond the estate's walls, and neither of them had any way of anticipating how soon it would arrive. 5 weeks after the dancing began, Solomon's younger sister Adiz visited the estate for a scheduled business review and found her brother in the garden, not sitting motionless beneath the flame tree as he had for 11 months, but attempting, with visible effort and a 6-year-old's enthusiastic coaching, to shift his weight forward in his wheelchair in time with a rhythm the girl was clapping out beside him. Adiz stood frozen at the edge of the lawn for a long moment before finally speaking. Solomon, what is this? This, Solomon said, slightly out of breath, grinning in a way Adiz hadn't seen in nearly a year, is NMA. She's teaching me to dance. Adiz's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to alarm. Solomon, can I speak to you inside? Alone. Once they were behind the closed doors of his study, Adiz's carefully composed exterior cracked. You understand how this looks from the outside, she said. A grieving, isolated man suddenly convinced a child possesses some kind of healing gift. People are going to say she's manipulating you, or that her mother put her up to it. She hasn't asked me for anything, Solomon said, an edge of protectiveness creeping into his voice. Not once, I offered, she never asked. That's exactly what a careful arrangement looks like, Adiz said quietly. The ones who never ask directly are the ones you should watch most closely. Solomon felt something harden in his chest. I'm not discussing this further tonight. Solomon. Good night, Adiz. He sat alone afterward in the growing darkness of his study, telling himself his sister's warning meant nothing, even as some quiet, unwelcome part of him suspected it had already lodged itself somewhere he wouldn't easily dislodge it from. He had no idea, not yet, how close his sister's suspicion actually sat to a truth neither of them had uncovered. 2 days later, Adiz returned, requesting a private meeting that had nothing to do with NMA at all. I found something, she said, sliding a thin folder across his desk. Reviewing the insurance settlement from the accident, I wasn't looking for anything specific. I found this instead. Solomon opened the folder slowly, scanning the documents with growing confusion, then dawning, cold horror. A settlement addendum from Meridian Assurance, dated 4 months after his accident, back when he'd been too medicated and grieving to scrutinize fine print. A clause specifying that the company's total liability payout had been calculated based on a permanent, irreversible disability classification, a classification that limited their ongoing exposure. Attached 3 pages later, a consulting fee paid to the neurosurgeon who had delivered his original diagnosis with such practiced, rehearsed certainty. Dr. Emeka Nwachukwu. Solomon sat frozen, his mind racing back through 11 months of appointments and carefully worded discouragement. Every time he'd asked about recovery, Nwachukwu had shut the conversation down immediately, using language Solomon now understood hadn't been protecting him from false hope at all. It had been protecting a financial arrangement he'd never been meant to discover. How long have you had this? He asked quietly. 3 months, Adiz admitted. I didn't know how to raise it. Then you told me about the sensation returning. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. Solomon called his family's attorney the following morning, a formidable woman named Chidinma Balagun, and laid the discovery out across the conference table. This is significant, Chidinma said, once she'd reviewed every page. If this pattern extends beyond your case, we're looking at coordinated insurance fraud, potentially affecting an unknown number of patients. I want it investigated properly, Solomon said. Quietly for now, but thoroughly. Over the following weeks, while a parallel investigation unfolded quietly behind the scenes, Solomon's physical recovery continued its slow, steady progress. What began as a single-arm sweep expanded, session by session, into full mirrored sequences, then supported weight shifts. Then, 8 weeks after the dancing began, something neither of them had dared hope for out loud. Standing. It happened inside the private rehabilitation room Solomon had installed in the converted pool house, wooden parallel bars bolted into the floor at Dr. Falek Bankel's recommendation. Once repeated scans confirmed something genuinely unusual occurring in his neural pathways. His legs trembled violently with the effort, sweat beading across his forehead, but he stood, entirely under his own power. NMA, watching from the doorway with Grace beside her, screamed with such pure delight that the head housekeeper came running from the kitchen, convinced someone had been seriously hurt. "Now dance with me properly," NMA demanded the moment he'd caught his breath, and Solomon, gripping the parallel bars, trembling, laughing, shifted his weight from one foot to the other in the closest approximation of dancing his body had managed in nearly a year. Grace cried harder that evening than she had at any point since her mother's funeral. That night, Solomon called Adiz, not about the investigation, but simply to tell her what had happened. There was a long pause on the line before she finally spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what I said about the girl. I was wrong, and I should have trusted you instead of assuming the worst about the first good thing to happen to you in nearly a year." But even as one relationship began healing, the storm Adiz's own discovery had set into motion was already gathering momentum far beyond either of their control. 10 weeks after the dancing began, Solomon took his first unaided steps across the width of the rehabilitation room, 6 unsteady steps, entirely his own. 3 days later, a story broke across several Lagos news outlets simultaneously, timed with a precision that suggested a deliberate, strategic leak. Billionaire's bizarre recovery. Housemaid's daughter accused of exploiting grieving tycoon. The article, syndicated within hours, described an isolated, vulnerable billionaire targeted by a domestic worker and her young daughter who had gained unauthorized access to his estate. It featured a grainy photograph, taken with a long-range lens from beyond the outer wall, showing NMA mid-dance beside his wheelchair, out of context, stripped of everything that had actually happened, looking exactly as damning as the article intended. Within hours, the photograph had been shared across every major platform, accumulating millions of views. Comment sections filled with cruelty directed at a 6-year-old child, calling her a future con artist, accusing Grace of exploiting her own daughter, questioning whether the girl should remain in her mother's custody. Solomon's phone rang continuously. He found Chidinma on the line within minutes, her voice tight with controlled fury. "This didn't leak by accident," she said. "The timing is too precise. Someone is trying to discredit you before you can go public with what you actually found." He called Grace immediately. She picked up on the first ring, her voice tight with barely controlled distress. "NMA came home from school crying today," she said. "Some of the older children showed her the article. They called her a liar to her face. She's 6 years old." "Let me talk to her," Solomon said quietly. Enma's voice, when it came through, sounded smaller than he'd ever heard it. "They said I'm a liar. They said Mama is using me for money." "You are not a liar," Solomon said, his voice fierce. "NMA, listen to me. I stood up on my own 2 feet 3 days ago. I danced badly, but I danced. That happened because of you, because you refused to give up on me even when I'd given up on myself. Nobody's cruel words can erase that. It's real, you're real." "Then why does everyone say it isn't?" NMA asked, her small voice breaking his heart clean in half. "Because sometimes," he said carefully, "people can't handle believing something good happened in an unexpected way. It's easier to call it fake than admit the world still has room for miracles they don't understand. That's not about you. That's about them." Dear listener, if you're invested in what happens next, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel before we continue. Now, back to the truth Solomon was about to expose. Over the following days, the media storm intensified. Meridian Assurance issued a carefully worded statement suggesting unverified alternative treatments carried inherent risks, designed to plant doubt about Solomon's judgment without directly attacking him. A national mourning program, aired a panel discussing whether child welfare authorities should investigate Grace for exposing her daughter to an exploitative arrangement. Grace called Solomon that evening, her voice hollow with fear. "A caseworker contacted me today. They're asking whether NMA should remain in my custody." "That is not going to happen," Solomon said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "I promise you, Grace." "You can't promise that," she said, her voice breaking. "You're powerful, but you're not more powerful than a system that's already decided what kind of mother a woman like me is allowed to be." "Watch me," Solomon said quietly. That night, he called Chidinma with urgent instructions. The best family law attorney in Lagos, retained by morning. Dr. Bankel's complete medical documentation, ready for any welfare inquiry. Then he began writing a public statement of his own. 4 days later, Solomon Ademi walked into a press conference held at Dr. Bankel's clinic, using a cane rather than his wheelchair, a detail every assembled journalist noted immediately. 11 months ago, I was told my paralysis was complete and permanent, he began, his voice steady despite the visible effort walking still required. 5 weeks into what became 11 weeks, a 6-year-old girl named NMA walked into my garden, and instead of asking me to believe in some ritual, simply started dancing until I couldn't help but move with her. I nearly had her removed from my property. I have never in my entire life been more grateful for a mistake I almost made. He gestured toward Dr. Bankel and the documentation she carried. What I'm standing here to tell you is that what happened afterward was not manipulation. It was a genuine, measurable, independently verified recovery. He nodded to Chidinma, who began distributing printed copies of the investigation's findings. I'm also here to tell you why a distorted version of this story was leaked in the first place, timed precisely to bury an investigation my legal team had already begun. My original treating neurosurgeon classified my injury as permanently disabling, a classification that directly benefited an insurance company paying him consulting fees for years. That same doctor dismissed early signs of my recovery as psychological. I have documentation showing a pattern of similar classifications across other cases, none disclosed to the patients affected. The press conference dominated headlines within hours, the narrative shifting almost immediately from questions about NMA's legitimacy to a full-blown investigation into Meridian Assurance. Within a week, regulators announced a formal inquiry. Within 2 weeks, 3 other patients came forward independently. Dr. Nwachukwu's medical license was suspended pending investigation. Meridian Assurance's stock dropped sharply. The caseworker complaint against Grace was formally dismissed, the investigating agency finding no evidence of endangerment and considerable evidence of a genuine, positive relationship. But even as vindication arrived, Solomon noticed NMA had grown quieter. The unshakable confidence that had first carried her past his security detail, visibly dimmed by weeks of public cruelty, most adults would have struggled to withstand. He resolved that legal victory alone would not be enough. She deserved to be celebrated, publicly, unmistakably, in a way that would erase every cruel word directed at her. 6 weeks later, invitations went out for the Ademi Family Foundation's annual gala. Grace had grown increasingly nervous as the event approached. Solomon visited her personally to extend the invitation. "I need you both there," he said, "not as staff, as the reason any of this recovery happened at all." "And if it goes wrong?" Grace asked. "If people are cruel to her again in person this time?" "They won't be," Solomon said. "Because by the time the night is over, nobody in that room is going to have any doubt left about what NMA did." The night of the gala arrived under a clear Lagos sky. Backstage, Solomon stood in a private preparation room, his cane resting against the wall, his suit tailored perfectly, betraying none of the trembling nervousness beneath the composed exterior. Across the city, Grace helped NMA into a soft blue dress. "Grandma Ijoma would be proud of tonight, wouldn't she?" NMA asked quietly. "She'd be more proud than you could ever know," Grace said, her eyes filling. When the car arrived, flashing cameras and shouted questions greeted them, exactly the scrutiny Grace had feared. But the head housekeeper appeared, guiding them gently through the chaos toward the ballroom entrance. Inside, the ballroom's conversation dimmed as guests recognized who had arrived. The evening proceeded through its scheduled program, foundation announcements, polite applause. Everyone understood the real reason they'd been invited still waited ahead. Finally, the master of ceremonies stepped to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a man whose journey this past year has inspired all of us, Solomon Adami." Solomon walked onto the stage. Slowly, carefully, using his cane, each step visibly requiring genuine effort but entirely his own. The ballroom fell into complete, stunned silence. Then the silence broke into applause that grew louder with each step, guests rising one by one, until the entire room stood, applauding a recovery that 11 months earlier every credentialed expert had declared impossible. 11 months ago, I was told I would never walk again, he began. Then a 6-year-old girl walked into my garden and instead of asking me to believe in anything, simply started dancing until I forgot I wasn't supposed to be able to move with her. Soft, warm laughter rippled through the room. Some of you read the stories calling her a liar, calling her mother exploitative. I want to be very clear, in front of every person in this room and every camera recording this moment. NMA Ockhafer never once asked me for anything. She offered help because she believed, with more conviction than I've ever witnessed from anyone in my life, that helping was simply what you did when you saw someone hurting. He looked toward the side entrance. "NMA, would you join me up here?" NMA emerged, small and visibly nervous in her blue dress, walking the long distance toward the stage under the weight of hundreds of watching eyes. Grace followed a few steps behind. When NMA reached the podium, Solomon knelt down to her level. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his jacket and producing a folder. NMA opened it slowly, her small hands trembling. "What is it?" she finally asked. "It's a full scholarship trust," Solomon said, "covering every year of your education. Along with funding for the Ijoma Ockhafer Foundation, a rehabilitation center I'm establishing in your grandmother's honor, offering exactly the kind of care you gave me, free of charge, to any family who needs it." The ballroom erupted into applause, guests rising fully to their feet, many wiping away tears. "Grandma Ijoma always said knowledge isn't real until you share it," NMA said, her voice small but clear enough for the microphone to catch. "Then let's share it," Solomon said, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "With everyone who needs exactly what you gave me." Grace reached the stage, pulling her daughter into a fierce embrace, both of them crying openly. Then, without warning, Solomon extended a hand toward NMA. "One more dance," he said, "right here, in front of everyone." The ballroom held its breath as the small girl in the blue dress took the billionaire's hand, and the two of them, one leaning on a cane, one barely tall enough to reach his waist, swayed together in the center of the stage, while the entire room rose to applaud what had once been dismissed, in cruel headlines, as manipulation and fraud, now fully, undeniably revealed as exactly what it had always been. Dear listener, if this moment moved you even half as much as it moved everyone in that ballroom, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's see what came after that night. 6 months after the gala, the Ijoma Ockhafer Foundation opened its doors in a converted wing of Solomon's estate, offering free physical therapy combined with the traditional healing techniques Enma's grandmother had practiced for decades, to any family unable to afford conventional treatment. Grace left domestic service entirely to become the foundation's administrative director. NMA, now 7, spent her afternoons there after school, no longer sneaking past security but walking confidently through the front entrance, greeted by staff and patients who had come to recognize her as the foundation's youngest, most beloved presence. Solomon's recovery continued steadily, though Dr. Bankel cautioned that full restoration would require years, not months. Meridian Assurance settled with over 30 patients identified through the regulatory investigation. Dr. Nwachukwu's license was permanently revoked. And every afternoon, Without fail, NMA made her rounds through the Foundation's therapy rooms, greeting new patients with the same steady confidence that had first carried her past a billionaire's security detail, ready to offer the same promise that had once seemed impossible to an entire ballroom of skeptics, and now needed no defense at all. "Your body didn't forget how to move," she would tell each new patient. "It just fell asleep. Let's wake it up, and then we'll dance." 3 years later, on a warm evening, the Foundation held its annual celebration beneath the old flame tree that had shaded Solomon's wheelchair the very first afternoon. A small girl decided, with total, unearned confidence, that today was the day she'd make a stranger move again. Solomon, now walking with only the occasional need for a cane, stood beside Grace, watching NMA, now 9, kneel beside a new patient, a shy 7-year-old boy still visibly doubtful that anything could help him. "You know," Grace said quietly, "my mother used to say some things in life are bigger than we can fully understand. I think she meant exactly this." Solomon reached for Grace's hand. "I used to think miracles were things that happened to other people," he said. "I don't believe that anymore." Across the garden, NMA looked up, caught her mother's eye, and offered the same steady smile she'd worn since the very first afternoon she decided a stranger's sleeping legs simply needed something to dance to. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments what stayed with you the most. And remember, sometimes the people who change our lives most completely arrive carrying nothing but conviction, asking for nothing in return, and leave us wondering how we ever survived without them at all.